Hi, my name is Chris and this is Battle Nonsense. Today I will show you some interesting things that I encountered while I was testing the beta of Lawbreakers. Some I have seen before in other games I tested, while one particular aspect of the Lawbreakers netcode reminded me a lot of the good old Battlefield 2 days. But first we must talk about a few networking basics which you need to know to understand the results of my tests. The reason why I always include this basic information on YouTube while my patrons can get a cut to the chase version on Vimeo is that on YouTube I must consider that these videos attract new viewers who have never seen such a netcode analysis before, and so they might not know what I mean when I talk about tick rates, update rates or latency. In the past I did not include that basic information in every video. Instead I told my audience to please go to another video first, which did provide that information. Sadly, the comments on these videos and the YouTube analytics showed that no one followed this advice, and as a result many people were either confused by my test results or they just misinterpreted them. So, since I'm only doing these videos to help players to get a better understanding of networking in video games, I decided to always include this basic information when I test a new game or when it's been a long time since the last one. This is really the only way how I can ensure that someone who is new to this gets all the required information. But I didn't forget about those of you who already know the networking basics, so if you don't want to refresh your memory, then you can skip that part of the video with the timecode link that you find in the description down below, as well as in the pinned comment of this video. So let's dive into the networking basics then, where we will start with the ping. Now, what is that and where does the term come from? If you've seen the movie The Hunt for Red October, then you might remember that scene where Sean Connery gave the order to use a single active sonar ping to re-verify their range to the target. The way this works is that your ship or submarine sends out an audio signal, which then gets reflected by other objects in the water. This reflection is then received by microphones or hydrophones installed on your ship, and that then allows you to determine the distance between you and that object by measuring the time between sending the audio signal and receiving the reflection. So when we talk about network connections, then the ping between different devices is pretty much the same thing. Your device sends an ICMP echo request to another network device like a game server, which then sends an ICMP echo reply back to your device. When we then measure the time between sending the request and receiving the answer, then we get the ping or round-trip time of the data. So the ping tells us how long data has to travel through the copper and fiber optic cables to reach the other device. And the longer it takes data to reach its destination, the greater the difference between what we see on our monitor and what the other players see on theirs, which is what we call lag. So when I jump, then it takes some time until that information reaches the server and then the other client. With short distances and good routing between the players and the server, this delay or lag is very low. However, the bigger the distance between the clients and the server, the longer it will take until these receive an update on what is happening. So the higher your ping, the more you will lag, which means that you have a bad experience. But it's not just the player with the high ping that suffers. Depending on how strong the lag compensation is in a game, the player with the high ping can also degrade the experience of players who have a low ping, as these then either receive damage far behind cover or get shot before they can even see the player with the high ping. Developers have tried many different solutions to fix or at least mitigate this issue. Some have tried to use a region lock, but that does not work, as network congestion can cause your ping to go from a stable 20 milliseconds to 300 milliseconds at any time. So what can be done? The brute force solution is to disconnect players who have a ping high enough to cause that issue. However, that will hurt your sales and communities which have members across the globe. DICE uses a quite interesting approach to attack this issue in Battlefield 1, which I want to show you now. Here we have a player with a ping of about 47 milliseconds, let's call him player 1. And then we got the shooter, player 2, who has a ping of about 147 milliseconds. When player 2 now fires at player 1, then the client of player 2 will run the hit registration, which figures out that player 1 has been hit. The client of player 2 then sends this information to the server, which runs its own check to confirm the hit. When the server agrees, then it sends the hit confirmation back to player 2 and the damage data to player 1. This form of hit registration is called client-side server authoritative, because while the client does the hit registration, the server must still confirm the hit or no damage will be dealt. When I then slightly increase the ping of player 2 to about 157 milliseconds, then player 2 gets the aim lead indicator, which tells him that his ping to the server is too high. When player 2 now fires at player 1 again, then the hit will not register anymore, because the hit registration now changed from client-side server authoritative to fully server-side. But when player 2 then leads his shot, which means that he just has to fire a little bit earlier, then the shot registers again. This allows player 2 to still hit other players while not making the issue of receiving damage behind cover worse. So once the ping of player 2 is higher than the configured threshold, his hit registration switches from client-side server authoritative to fully server-side, where the server won't compensate for the delay of player 2. This means that the only perspective that now matters is the one from the server, and where he sees player 1 when it receives the information about the shot that player 2 fired. This is how DICE tries to mitigate the issue where players with low pings die far behind cover, while still allowing players from all over the world to come together and play their game. Now, what affects your ping to the game server or your lag in general? One factor that you already know of is the distance between you and the game server. However, it is not possible to determine your ping by taking a map and drawing a straight line between your home and the location where the server is hosted. Because the copper and fiber optic cables take a very different route, and the data that you send to the server has to pass through multiple routers before it reaches the server. So when a router has to forward data, then it tries to use the best route. This means that when everything works as it should, then your data should take the shortest route to the game server. However, it can happen that a router either chooses a bad route or that it has to choose a worse one when the better one is down. Such can then lead to quite big detours for your data, which can also result in much higher pings and an increased risk of packet loss, since your data might have to pass through many more routers then. So when you suddenly notice a much higher ping to your favorite server, then this could be caused by the routing. In this case, you will then have to call your internet service provider so that they can check their routing tables. If you want to get the issue fixed faster, then you can provide them with traceroute data for that server. For that, you open the command prompt, type in traceroute and the IP of the game server that you have problems with. You will then get a list of all the hops between you and the game server with the ping between you and each of these hops. However, please be aware that depending on its configuration, a hop might not reply to your ICMP echo request or with a greater delay. The same is true for game servers where many do not reply when you try to ping them from the command prompt. So the length of the route that connects the client to the server and the amount of hops between them affects how long it takes data to reach its destination. This means that the lag that we experience in a game can never be lower than the travel time of the data, unless we figure out a way to break the laws of physics to speed up the electrons or photons that are used for the communication between the client and the server. What adds an extra delay on top of the travel time of our data is how frequently we send and receive it. So when we send and receive 30 updates per second, then there is more time between updates than when we send and receive 60. So by sending and receiving more updates per second, you can decrease the additional delay that is added on top of the travel time of your data. But where is that data coming from? This is where the term tick or simulation rate comes into play, which is how many times per second the game processes and produces data. So when you have a tick or simulation rate of 60, then this will cause less delay than when you use a tick rate of 30. A tick rate of 60 will also allow the server to send 60 updates per second. But not only the number of simulations that are done per second is important. It's also critical that the server finishes a tick as fast as possible, because at a tick rate of 60 Hz it only has a processing window of 16.66 milliseconds, inside which it must finish a simulation step. So at the beginning of a new tick, the server starts to process the data it received and runs its simulations. After that, it then sends the results to the clients and then sleeps until the next tick happens. The faster the server finishes a tick, the earlier the clients will receive new data from the server, which reduces the delays between players and makes the hit registration feel more responsive. This is something that I showed in my Battlefield 4 tests, where the net graph displays the time the server needs to finish a tick. So when it comes to the server's performance, then it's imperative that it finishes a simulation step as fast as possible, or at least inside the processing window that is given by the tick rate. When it gets close to that limit or even fails to process a tick inside that time frame, then you will instantly notice this, as that results in all sorts of strange gameplay issues like rubber banding, players teleporting, hits getting rejected, physics failing, etc. Now, what kind of options do developers have when it comes to the network model? One solution is that you pay hosters to set up dedicated servers for your games in their data centers, to which the players then connect to. This means that your game server is running on powerful hardware and the data center has enough bandwidth to handle all those players that connect to it. Also, when the matchmaking makes sure that all players have more or less the same ping to the game server, then you can avoid that some players have an unfair advantage in some situations, or give players with low pings a bad experience. The downside of dedicated servers is that if you don't have a game that builds around the idea of the community running these servers, then the publisher or studio has to pay for them, and they are quite expensive. Another challenge is that if you release your game worldwide, then you must also make sure that all players who buy the game have access to low latency servers. If you do not do that, then you create many players with high pings, and that is a problem for your entire community, not just the players who don't have servers near them. A different approach, which many people falsely refer to as peer-to-peer, is that you simply use the PC or console of one of the players to host the game, which means that he essentially becomes the server. With this solution, the game studio does not have to pay for expensive dedicated servers, and it also allows players located in a remote region to play with their friends at relatively low latency. One of the many downsides that this network model is suffering from is that the player who is also the server gets an advantage, because he has zero lag. This causes that he will see you before you see him, and he can fire at you before you can fire at him. Then we also have the problem that all players connect to the host through his consumer-grade internet connection, when in the worst case he could even use Wi-Fi. This frequently results in a lot of lag, packet loss, rubber banding, and an unreliable hit registration. But the most infuriating part of such a client-hosted match is the host migration, which is the process where the whole game pauses for several seconds while a different player is elected to replace the host that just left. Then we got the peer-to-peer network model, which you mostly see in 1v1 fighting games, but there are also a few other multiplayer games that have more than 2 players which use peer-to-peer. And since there are different variations of this network model, I will use For Honor as reference in this explanation. So in this network model we do not have a dedicated game server, nor is a client elected to host the match and run the simulation. However, we at least need a session host which takes care of invites and handshakes. That could be done by a dedicated server, or like in For Honor, a client is used for that task, which is also why the game will pause for several seconds until a new session host has been elected should the previous one leave. Another downside is that because every client runs its own simulation, the responsiveness of the hit registration might also vary depending on the ping of the player you engage. So when you fight a player to which you have a ping of 5 milliseconds, then the hit registration might feel better than when you engage a player to which you have a ping of 148 milliseconds. Or players with a high ping make the hit registration less responsive in general, as the clients keep their simulation in sync. Probably the biggest downside of this network model is security, as every game client knows and sees the WAN IP addresses of the other players. Besides that, there are a few other concerns that this peer-to-peer network model has in common with client-hosted matches, like the impact of underpowered hardware used by the players, as well as the players' consumer-grade internet connection, as all clients talk to each other to keep their simulation in sync. And anti-cheat is also always a very big concern in games that do not have an authoritative game server. So even though dedicated game servers do not magically provide 100% lag-free connections, I believe that they offer the best possible experience in online multiplayer games where you have more than 2 players participating in a match. Now, before I show you the results of my tests, I want to explain how I measure the delay that 2 players are affected by in a multiplayer game. To test this, I use a high-speed camera, 2 PCs where each of them has its own fiber internet connection, and a 144Hz gaming monitor on which the game runs at more than 144 FPS with all graphic options set to the lowest value. To measure the delays between the players, I point my high-speed camera at the monitors and then have player 2 shoot 20 times at player 1. Inside the high-speed recording, I then look for the frame where I see that player 2 starts to fire, and then I count the frames until I see that the damage was received by player 1, which is indicated by either blood splatter, a damage indicator, or the update of the health indicator, depending on what happens first and what is available in the game. In addition to this damage delay test, I also check the delay of the gunfire animation, as well as the movement delay. Now let's talk about the beta of Lawbreakers and its netcode. First of all, you will hopefully be happy to hear that the developers decided to use dedicated game servers instead of the client-hosted or peer-to-peer network models. Also, when you create a custom match, then this will spawn a dedicated server instance, so the gameplay experience in a custom match should be the same as in a public match. Sadly, there is also bad news, because the beta only provided servers in 5 different regions, and that's not enough, because this is why we see lots of players with a ping of 200 milliseconds or more. They simply don't have any better servers to join. The publisher and the studio must work on this issue and drastically increase the amount of locations where servers are provided in, to ensure that everyone who buys the game has low latency servers near them. If this is not achieved, then everyone's gameplay experience will suffer, as I am going to show you a bit later. Now let's have a look at the update rates. The network data I captured with Wireshark shows that every 16 milliseconds I receive an update from the game server, which means that I receive a steady stream of 60 updates per second from the server. The rate at which a client sends updates to the server is however linked to the frame rate that the game is running at. So at 170 FPS, most of the updates sent by the client are about 6 milliseconds apart, while sometimes there are 12 to 16 milliseconds between two updates. However, when I lock my frame rate at 60 by using the built-in frame rate limiter, which I'm really grateful for because this is a must-have feature for every gamer who owns a G-Sync or FreeSync display, then my client will only send an update to the server every 16 milliseconds. So the send rate of the client is clearly affected by its frame rate, which can lead to issues as we have seen in the Quake Champions beta, where packets per second can become a problem before the available bandwidth. It also has to be said that when a game runs at a tick rate of 60 Hz, then you gain very little from sending updates more frequently than 60 times per second. So I think that the developers should have a limit in place which does not allow the client to send more than 60 or maybe 120 updates per second, because rates higher than that increase the risk of connectivity issues while not really decreasing the delay any further. Now, how does this affect the game? In my last video I showed you that the upstream bandwidth usage increases quite a bit in Quake Champions when you increase the frame rate. However, this is not quite the case in Lawbreakers, as the additional data packets are very small, and so the upstream traffic does not increase much at higher frame rates. But as I said before, packets per second can become a limiting factor before bandwidth, so that is something that we must keep in mind here. The frame rate also affects the ping which is displayed inside the scoreboard. Here inside the options menu, the game tells me that I have a ping of 24 milliseconds to European servers, or the ping site used for this region to be more specific. When I then join a game server, then NetLimiter allows me to find out the IP address of the game server. Sadly, the server does not respond to an ICMP echo request. However, if the IP location search is correct, then this Amazon cloud server is located in Frankfurt, which is Amazon's EU Central 1. Now, when I search for the IP address inside the IP ranges available here, then we can see that this game server is indeed located inside EU Central 1. And when I ping this data center, then I get a ping of 16 to 18 milliseconds, while inside the scoreboard I get a ping of 32 milliseconds. When I then allow the game to run at more than 170 FPS, then we can see that my ping went down to 28 milliseconds inside the scoreboard. While when I limit my frame rate at 60 FPS, then it goes up to 36 milliseconds. To prove that the ping display is really affected by the frame rate, I use RTSS to cap it at 10 FPS, which then increases my ping to 100 milliseconds inside the scoreboard. So this should make clear that the latency that we see here is about the game data that is sent and received by the client, as well as the processing delays of at least the client. Because of that, the ping inside the scoreboard will always be greater than your ICMP ping to the game server, and most likely also higher than what you see inside the region selection. Now let's take a look at the delay that two players experience when they play on the same server. With a ping of 18 milliseconds to the EU Central 1 data center of Amazon where the game server was hosted, I measured an average delay of 40 milliseconds for damage, 40.5 milliseconds for gunfire, and 50.75 milliseconds for movement. Now, since Quake Champions also links the client's send rate to the frame rate, I would have preferred to provide you with test results where Lawbreakers ran at 144 FPS. Sadly, I only realized that Lawbreakers does the same after I finished my tests, and since the beta will end soon, I'm sadly not able to rerun all my tests at 144 FPS. But if the final version of Lawbreakers still links the client's send rate to its frame rate, then I will make sure to lock the frame rate at 144 when I test it then. When we then look at these results and compare them to the other games I tested, then we must keep in mind that with the exception of Quake Champions, none of them has the client's send rate linked to the frame rate. Also, my ping to the game server was 18 milliseconds in Lawbreakers, while when I tested Overwatch and CSGO, I had a ping of 25 milliseconds to the game server. With that in mind, Lawbreakers still shows one of the best netcode performances of all the 60Hz tick rate games that I have tested so far, which is a great result and a solid foundation for a good online experience. Now, in my videos I always show you how the hit registration works when a player whose ping is very high shoots at a player who has a very low ping. Such usually degrades the gameplay experience of the player who has a low ping, as he receives that hit with a great delay behind solid cover. So before I increased the ping of the shooter, I decided to do a few tests where both players had a low ping to the game server. The first shot I fired connected with the target player as expected. However, the next 10 shots failed to register even though I clearly hit him. At least I think I did based on the video footage that you can see here. So after 10 of my shots failed to register, my 11th shot suddenly connected with the player again, even though I didn't do anything different. So in my tests the hit registration was far from consistent when I tried to hit a moving player, and I don't have any explanation what could have caused this, as my connection to the server was stable, at least as much as I can tell, because the game does not offer any form of network performance icons nor a network graph that would allow me to tell if I had latency variation or packet loss when one of these shots did not register. Now, what happens when the shooter has a ping of more than 250 milliseconds, which can happen when the player does not have servers near him, or when he is suffering from network congestion which results in a sudden ping spike? This is the part that reminded me of Battlefield 2, because in order to have his shot register, the player who has a high ping must shoot behind the player. Yes, you heard me right, he does not have to lead his shot to compensate for his latency, he has to aim behind him, which is not intuitive at all and should be changed in my opinion. Sadly, I did not have the time during the beta to test many more different latency values to find out where this starts to really affect your aim, but I will do that once the final version of Lawbreakers gets released. A question that I frequently get is if players with a high ping are harder to hit for players who have a low ping. So in this example here, the target player has a ping of more than 250 milliseconds, while the shooter has a ping of 32 milliseconds. And as you can see, the player with the low ping does not have to aim behind or ahead of the player to hit him, because the only perspectives that matter for the hit registration now are the ones from the shooter and the server. So after I finished my tests, I thought about what I would like to see the developers work on in the near future. I think most important is that the studio and the publishers increase the amount of locations where servers are hosted, because this is how you reduce the amount of players who are suffering from a very high ping. Titanfall 2 is a good example how to do this right, as they did not only use cloud services from Google, Amazon and Microsoft, but also contracted Multiplay to host game servers for them in locations where none of the cloud services have data centers yet. This is surely more expensive for the studio. However, this is the only way how you can ensure that your players have a great online experience. Also critical for the online experience is that the game is able to change the update rates in order to avoid issues, like Battlefield 1 and Overwatch are able to. Here the developers might also want to think about limiting how many updates per second the client can send to the server, as packets per second can become a limiting factor before the bandwidth. Also, you gain very little from sending updates more frequently than 60 times per second when your game uses a tick rate of 60 Hz. So the gain does not quite justify the potential risk of causing connectivity issues for the player. And lastly, it would be great to have network performance icons and a network graph which tell the player when his connection to the server is suffering from packet loss, a lot of latency variation, or a just too high ping in general. So I hope that you enjoyed the netcode analysis of the Lawbreakers beta, and I will keep you updated on the changes that the developers do to the networking and the servers of this game. Now, you can surely imagine that a video like this one here takes a lot of time to make. Everything considered, it's usually somewhere between 20 to 30 hours from start to finish. But besides the time that I spent on a single video, running this channel is also not exactly cheap. Not just because of the hardware and software I need to be able to do it, but also because I don't get review copies of the games I test. And so I must buy not one, but 2 copies whenever I test a new one. So if you like this kind of content where I take a look at the inner workings of video games and show you how these affect your experience, then you can help me to cover the costs of this channel by supporting me on Patreon. The link is in the description below. Also, if you want to stay up to date on what I'm currently working on, then you can follow me on Twitter or Facebook, the links are also in the description of this video. And if you don't want to miss the next one, then you might want to subscribe to my channel and click on that bell icon below this video to receive a notification when I upload the next one. So if you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like, subscribe for more, and I hope to see you next time. Until then, have a nice day and take care. My name is Chris and this was Battle Nonsense.